As people know, and if you don't know, this is going to be the main topic of the conversation, is that you are an expert in campaigns, engaging people to put some pressure on some issues on the government. So why don't we start by explaining what is a campaign, what is the origin, what is the objective of a campaign, and how it links with digital advocacy strategies and actions.
Yeah, I would say the way I think about campaigns is creating almost like a multi-sensory experience that overwhelms the targets that we're going after. So in the context of a campaign that's trying to change regulatory outcomes, is creating a tsunami, momentum, where whether you are turning on the radio station, whether you are watching the news, whether you're looking at your Facebook feed, the issue that we're campaigning, that we care about, is omnipresent. It's everywhere. And for the person on the receiving end to realize it is everywhere. And so it becomes something that someone has to deal with. So very multisensory across different channels, and building momentum.
Why don't we start by explaining, I don't know, to the audience, sometimes it's not that easy to figure out an example of that. What is a campaign? How campaigns look like, and if you have an example to share.
Definitely. So I will go, I often say politics is very local. Even if we're running on a national campaign, we're gonna make it local. But I often think starting with a local example is probably the best. We ran a campaign in Ontario in a municipality that needed a new hospital very badly. The hospital that was there was in very rough shape. It had not been renovated significantly in years, decades and decades, and the quality of the care was very bad. The result was that very few companies wanted to come to this city to invest. And they'd always say, well, the healthcare infrastructure is not in great shape. We're not going to move our employees here. So the problem was, and the reason we got to that place is because there was a small group of people who were always vocal in opposing the site selection for the hospital. And because they were so vocal, government after government after government was convinced that the entire community was against it. Of course, that's never true. Often, very loud vocal groups can disproportionately sway political outcomes or regulatory outcomes or getting projects built. So we dealt with that by recruiting and communicating with the rest of the community and finding people that wanted the hospital built and were okay with it on the current site selection. And so we mobilized them. We got them to sign up to join the campaign. We got them to send letters to the appropriate elected officials. We got stakeholders, so we got physicians and nurses and those who are experts about that hospital to communicate via video, via audio, and via written forms the challenges that they're dealing with. And we got our supporters to put letters into the newspaper. So it became this thing where suddenly, over time, the issue had changed. And it went from a community that was opposed to the site selection to now clearly wanting it. And that allowed the government at the time to finally feel it would not receive any political blowback or would not suffer any political consequences if it supported the hospital. And then the government came forward and provided some funding. But it's that multi-sensory, doing it across all these channels.
And if you share like a scheme of steps to put together a campaign, how do you start? How do you follow? How do you end? How is that?
The first is understanding. So a lot of research. So the mistake I think some people might make when they run campaigns is to assume that they need to get people on side with the specific issue that they're focused on. Usually we have to take it a step back and we have to understand what values do people hold near and dear to their heart. How do they identify their value sets? Once we can figure out how they identify with their values, then it's a question of, does our issue align with those values? Often it does. It just requires a clear explanation of how it does. And then once we identify that roadmap, then we're able to run the campaign. So the steps is to start with research. Identify how voters align on their values, identify their understanding of the issue. Then once you've identified that, you develop your creative brief, you identify the channels where you'll have the most impact and the most reach, and then you launch your campaign. And the launching part is the easy part. The hard part is, once you've launched, is executing that campaign day in, day out. If you've ever worked on a political campaign, often they're very intense, but you at least know it'll come to an end. Whether it's 30 days or 45 days, depending on the constituency you're in. Oftentimes, if on big social issues, you have to keep grinding it out for months and months, if not years. And that's where I think the real success comes in. Do you have the discipline to execute and constantly be doing the campaign?
I see. In previous conversations, we were discussing about the difference between, just social media activity and other type of actions like letters, etc., that generate different impacts. Why don't you explain a little bit that issue, that difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very easy when, as a communicator, to think first about the tools that are easiest to use. And of course, the easiest tools for us to use is often social media. It's on everyone's mobile devices. We know that people will engage on it, as in they'll consume it. But something that is just as easy for us to use also reflects just how easy it is for someone to ignore, because it's so pervasive. And so demonstrating that you have had success because 150 people have retweeted your tweet, to me is not a marker of success, because it's very easy for someone to click that button. And that person may have clicked that button, but the likelihood that they have cognitively engaged with the campaign where they're thinking about it all the time, I think is very minimal. It also doesn't...
Politicians feel the same.
Politicians feel the same. It's, 150,000 tweets on this issue, that's par for the course. It's almost like I sometimes talk about social media as being like junk food, very high in calorie, but very little return on your nutrients. What is high calorie, very high return on your nutrients is when you find a way to engage with government directly.
And directly how?
That's going to depend on every issue, but certainly the ways that we like, the methods that we like to deploy, of course, are email and phone calls, and of course in-person meetings when we can facilitate that. And the reason for that is because very few people go through the effort or the hassle of engaging in those methods. So when you do, it gets noticed. I mean, I suppose if you're someone watching this, think, when's the last time on a political issue you called your local representative or your member of Congress to vocalize your perspective on it? My assumption is going to be very few people will actually do that. So when you do, you give yourself a lot more influence in the political process.
So what you do is, in the end, to help people to channel their thoughts, their point of view, whatever, through channels that finally have impact in the politicians, versus just leaving everything as it is and not, impacting them.
Yes.
Right? So in that perspective, do you think you change actually public opinion or what?
That's a good question. I mean, the problem I have with the term change public opinion is I fundamentally believe very few people actually change their opinion. If they do, it might take them a generation to do so, and it'll come with methodic exposure to a particular perspective. What people will do in a short period of time or in an election cycle over the course of a 15-20 year period is they will agree with a perspective that aligns with their values. Because to change your mind would be to confess that you were wrong and you had the wrong values to begin with. Very few people have the humility or the ability to reconstruct their ego that way. So the task for us as campaigners, from my perspective, is to align the campaign with the values of the people that we need to reach. And once you showcase to the person that they can hold their values and those values align with what the campaign's about, then I think you build support. And the key is to demonstrate how your issue affects people with different sets of values. That's how you create the mass required to get a large proportion of people to come on board. And that's what creates the effect of changing public opinion. Because if you're able to do it well, then you got people who may have, in some cases, actually opposing views on something. But because you're speaking to their shared values, you're able to bring them on. So it creates the appearance of changing public opinion.
Exactly. So that links with the idea of when you put together a campaign and you create a narrative, in the end you go deeply to the value blend, let's say, and you study, you make explicit what are the values that you're going to work on, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
It's to get to a point of the voter or the person we're trying to reach is going to think, they're going to ask themselves, why do I care about this? And does it feel right to care about this?
Mm-hmm.
It's that second part that I think we often, is easy to forget. We get so consumed by the why, and that's where we get into the facts and the arguments and the proof and all the evidence, which is important. You need to have that so that the person feels that they have something intellectual to point to when they're supporting your campaign. But it's how does this feel right? Why does this feel right to me is the more important part. And I think that is often what we're dealing with in that context is the emotional reaction. And campaigns are about emotions. People are very emotional beings, so we have to start with the basic premise that as emotional beings we should be communicating at an emotional level. And that is not to reduce it's not to say you need a very simplified way of communicating. I think we have an obligation as campaigners and communicators to speak the same language that people we're trying to mobilize. And I think the emotive drivers is what that frequency is.
So interesting. How is the blend of offline and online in a campaign?
I'm a sucker, as in I really love and adore offline tactics because you can have a lot of fun with them. So like we were running a campaign recently where our entire campaign was about the fact that there was a government monopoly that needed to be reformed.
Mm-hmm.
And as a way to drive attention to the issue, we designed our own custom Monopoly game board. And we got 3D printed all the pieces. It was all about the issue that we're dealing with. And because it's a government monopoly, no matter how you played it, you never won.
Mm-hmm.
And so we built this thing, we designed it, and then we shipped it out to reporters, and they got lots of media coverage. And that one tactic, while you're not going to necessarily recruit a lot of people to your campaign on that one issue, it is another way to illuminate the issue at hand. Other times we've projected slogans onto buildings, and in some campaigns we've gone door to door. We've knocked on doors to present the campaign to voters at their doorstep. And I think the best campaigns are those that, when it makes sense, do find a way to engage with people offline. Yes, we are all connected on mobile devices, so it's a very efficient way to reach people because we're constantly looking at our devices. But think about the last time you received a handwritten card in the mail, and the effect that created. At least in my case, I don't receive those a whole lot anymore. Mm-hmm. So when I do, it catches my attention. Of course. I open it, I was like, oh my goodness, the person took the time to find the card, to write it, and send it to me, put a postage stamp on it. Well, we ideally want to create that similar feeling when we can when we're campaigning. So finding a way offline, I think, offline engagement just carries a lot of power to persuade and to mobilize than exclusive digital channels can.
So it's very interesting. That challenges the idea of, word is becoming online. Everything is online. Lobbying is online. Communications is only online. And finally, the offline word still very powerful and maybe more than in the past because of that contrast, right?
I liken it to, I'm connected to my phone, and I may look at my phone when I'm designing a recipe and I'm having people over to my home, but what is that moment that we're sharing? is dinner together as friends and family. There's not a phone in the world that can replicate that experience, and we are human beings who need offline, real person engagement. I think we often make the mistake as campaigners to think, to forget that. Like, we're dealing with humans, so let's talk the human language, and in person is the best way to do it.